Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read Evicted, Poverty and Profit in the American City by Matthew Desmond. Before we hop in here, I would like to ask people to please share this from whatever platform you're listening to it on. We put these episodes out on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud. So just Pocket Cast, Anchor, wherever you're listening to this from, please share the link for me. And I want to encourage anybody who's listening who maybe has not heard previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily to please go check out those. And if by the time you get a hold of this, there's future episodes out, I would encourage you to please go and listen to those as well. Okay, so we are on chapter 22 of Evicted. We have about 60 or so pages left, if that. So let's dive in. Chapter 22. If they give Mama the punishment. In April, Vanetta hid candy Easter eggs around the lives for her children to find. Kendall let Timby and Bobo collect them. Sometimes, the boy already seemed finished with childhood. At 4 years old, he refused to hold Vanetta's hand and didn't like singing in his preschool class. A handsome boy, with pinched lips and espresso-colored eyes, he intuited that his mama had enough to worry about. This, of course, made Vanetta worry. A few days before Easter, Timby pulled the fire alarm. When management found out who was responsible, they told Vanetta she had to be out the next day. Vanetta didn't waste much time protesting. She headed straight for the heart of the ghetto and began calling on apartments. She called on every rent sign she saw, regardless of the condition of the house or the neighborhood. Excuse me, little yawn there. She toured a dirty apartment with cracks down the walls and grease on the ceiling on a block with abandoned homes and gang graffiti. She hated it and filled out an application. Quote, "Girl, you got put out because of your kids?" End quote, Crystal asked. That cold night on the porch, Crystal finally had gotten a hold of a cousin who allowed her to spend the night. After that, Crystal began sleeping in the waiting room of Whedon Francian, which she called, quote, St. Joseph's Hospital, end quote, and the newly remodeled Amtrak station downtown, where she tried blending in with waiting passengers. One day at a bus stop, she met a woman named Patricia. They were roommates by day's end. Crystal needed a place to stay, and Patricia, who had been plotting to toss her abusive husband, needed an income to replace his. Patricia was twice Crystal's age, with a teenage daughter in a single-family home in one of the quieter sections of the North Side. Crystal began calling Patricia, quote, Mom, end quote. The next day, Vanetta checked out of the lodge and took her things to her older sister's apartment. Ebony lived on Orchard Street, a residential street near the Hispanic Mission. Excuse me, sorry about that. Ebony lived on Orchard Street, a residential street near the Hispanic Mission, in a small 3-bedroom upper with her husband, 3 kids, and Vanetta's younger sister. The place was cluttered and worn, with the stained beige carpet, mattresses in almost every room, and a small kitchen tucked in the back. Vanetta wasn't planning on staying long. She gave her sister $50, moved her kids into one of the small bedrooms, and headed downtown to the courthouse for Deshawn's reconfinement hearing. Deshawn was Bobo's father, and Vanetta thought she loved him. He was a good dad when he wasn't drinking. The police had picked him up 6 months earlier for a parole violation linked to a drug possession charge. As the judge weighed the facts of the case, he cited several 911 calls Vanetta had made when Deshawn got rough. Quote, and then on October 10th, a call from Vanetta Evans. And then on October 19th, another call from Vanetta Evans. End quote. Mortified, Vanetta put her hands in her face and cried. She remembered those calls and what had happened after she kicked Deshawn out. He returned later, drunk, smashed the door down, and beat her. After that incident, Vanetta remembered the landlord taking her rent money with one hand and handing her a 28-day, quote, no cause, end quote, eviction notice with the other. At the reconfinement hearing, the judge gave Deshawn 18 months. Vanetta almost never drank, but that night she bought a bottle of New Amsterdam gin and passed out next to her children. She slept through Crystal's phone call, so Crystal hung up and dialed her cousins and foster sisters. Her arrangement with Patricia had come undone. Patricia's 14-year-old daughter had taken Crystal's cell phone to school and either lost it or sold it. Crystal demanded compensation, but Patricia refused to pay. Quote, "I'm going to get you out of my house," end quote, Patricia yelled, drunk on wine mixed with E&J brandy. Crystal called her people for backup. They waited in the car. The women took their argument outside, and Patricia lost her balance and fell to the ground. Staring down, Crystal lifted her foot and brought it down on Patricia's face again and again. Seeing this, one of Crystal's sisters ran up and hit Patricia with a hammer. End quote. "Bitch, try it again," end quote, she yelled before pulling Crystal away. In pain, Patricia lay still on the sidewalk in fetal position. Crystal asked to be dropped off at St. Joseph's Hospital, where she spent the night. And then that brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter. And what stands out for me particularly is the alcohol. The alcohol, the alcohol abuse, how regularly we've seen that be, how regularly we've seen people using alcohol as a coping mechanism, how we've seen them using that alcohol as a coping mechanism, leading to them making irrational decisions or leading to them making violent decisions, how that leads to the police being involved, how the police becoming involved leads to the landlord becoming involved and trying to basically evict people for essentially being victimized or being abused. And we've just seen this cycle perpetuate, and we've seen it happen with white people. We've seen it happen with black people. We've seen it happen with women. We've seen it happen with men. And again, I think that when we're speaking about these issues, we have to be able to know the details and the depth of some of these things and be able to know some of the symptoms that come along with these things. And alcoholism comes along with poverty. Alcoholism comes along with depression and not having proper adequate care to mental health facilities, or not even just mental health facilities, but having proper or adequate understanding of mental health and how to keep your mind healthy. And all of these things perpetuate each other the same way. And alcoholism is another form of addiction. We've seen how drug addiction has affected people and perpetuated some of these issues that people have. And so I think that for me, reading that passage, that is what stands out to me. And also just the cycle of abuse that we continue to see happening over and over again. Okay, let's continue reading. After trying for 73 places, Vanetta and Crystal were approved for a $500 a month 2-bedroom apartment. Desperate tenants willing to overlook neglected repairs have found a desperate landlord willing to overlook evictions and convictions. The apartment's wood floors were sticky with grime, the front door didn't lock properly, and the bedrooms were so small they couldn't hold much more than a twin bed. In the kitchen, the sink was clogged, the floor tiles were chipped, and there was a wall of cabinets sealed shut with laminating paper. There were empty spaces where a stove and refrigerator once had been. There was, however, a tub. And the place was on 7th and Maple on the near south side. You could see Saint Stanislaus. You can see Saint Stanislaus twin steeples from the kitchen window. Vanetta thought it was a dangerous block. She had known the drug dealer on the corner since childhood. Quote, "It's wretched, but I'm tired of looking," end quote. Vanetta said, quote, "I don't want to take it, but it's the only option I got," end quote. The new friends moved into the apartment with a few garbage bags of clothes and toys between them. Crystal had left most of her things at Patricia's and considered them gone for good. The only piece of furniture in the place was an old, upholstered rocking chair someone had left behind. Vanetta and Crystal's plans was to stay for a year, but not long after moving in, Clara, a woman Crystal and Vanetta knew from the lodge, came over and used up Crystal's cell phone minutes. So Crystal put her through one of the apartment's windows. When the cops showed up, Crystal made herself a couple of sandwiches for the road. Vanetta used most of what she had saved at the shelter to pay for the shattered window and told Crystal not to come back. It was the only way the landlord would allow Vanetta and her children to stay. A few days later, Child Protective Services called Ebony's apartment asking for Vanetta. When Ebony called Vanetta to warn her, Vanetta suspected Crystal. Quote, "I'm going to kill that bitch," end quote, she vented to Shortcake. Quote, "Do you know that bitch called social services on me?" End quote. Quote, "You poured salt on her. Now she's going to pour salt on you," end quote, Shortcake said. Quote, "She pouring salt on my kids," end quote, Vanetta cried. The news about CPS had unnerved Vanetta. She didn't think they would allow her children to stay in an apartment with no stove or refrigerator. Vanetta was broke, but she went to a used appliances store anyway. Spanish music played over a clutter of used dishwashers, dryers, and other appliances. The owner, Mr. Rodriguez, a pudgy Mexican man with thick hair, identified different units piled in a small store with a stick resembling a teacher's pointer. Quote, "How much is your cheapest stove and cheapest refrigerator?" End quote, Vanetta asked. Quote, "Baking? No baking," end quote, Rodriguez asked with a thick accent. Vanetta shook her head no. She would be fine with the non-working oven. Rodriguez poked his stick in the direction of a small gas stove. Quote, "How much?" End quote, Vanetta asked. Quote, "$90," end quote. She shook her head no again. Quote, "Too high. How much?" End quote. Rodriguez shrugged. They went back and forth until Vanetta talked Rodriguez down to $80, including the hose piece, which he had wanted to sell separately. She found a refrigerator somewhere else and talked the guy down to $60. She borrowed the money from a friend, promising to pay it back the first of the month, and finished the day shopping at Aldi. At the checkout counter, she placed the ice cream sandwiches and other junk food at the end of the conveyor belt in case she ran out of food stamps and needed to put something back. After unloading the groceries, Vanetta slumped down exhausted in the rocking chair and lit a cigarette. If CPS came knocking, she was ready for them. Then other thoughts drifted in. She was still undecided about who she wanted to care for her children if she was sent to prison for the robbery. Lately, she was leaning toward a woman from her children's daycare. Quote, "I might go crazy, but I know they'd be taken care of," end quote, Vanetta told herself. Then there was Kendall's upcoming preschool graduation. Vanetta wanted to somehow find money to buy him a new pair of shoes for the big day. She wanted him to feel special, accomplished. In the inner city, much was made of early milestones. Later ones might never come. And then that brings us to a changing of the passage again within this chapter. So let's have a reflection. So the first thought I have after reading that is actually about a story from a book that we've read previously, the book High Risers. It was a story about a young kid who was shot going to school. It was a story about his mother. She was having the kid. She fell asleep and the house caught on fire. I think the kid ended up getting burned. But then he had recovered from the burns, and then she was taking him to school one day, and it was a shooting. Somebody was trying to shoot somebody. They missed who they was trying to shoot, and they shot the kid. He was very young, and this sentence here that says, she wanted him to feel special, accomplished. In the inner city, much was made of early milestones. Later ones might never come. And we've read so often about how those later milestones truly don't come for people in the inner city. Truly don't come with the same regularity for people of color and for poor people and working class people. And that is one of the extreme realities of poverty, the extreme realities of resources not being equitably given out to people, is that one of the results of that is death, is early death, is whether that early death be through disease, whether it be through accident, whether it be through violence. All of those things are abundant in these areas that we're reading about. And we continue to read about why people end up in those areas and the desperation that exists for them to end up in those areas. And we also continue to see why there are such we also continue to see violence and turmoil in interpersonal relationships. And a lot of that is we see be completely or be very much directed or connected to poverty and the strains of poverty leading to people becoming violent more often or leading to people having psychological traumas that lead to them being violent more often. And so we've seen in the passage we just read that because Crystal didn't have a phone with unlimited minutes and unlimited minutes, that somebody using up all her minutes was something that was caused a drastic reaction from her or brought about a drastic reaction from her. And that's an issue that only exists for people who are poor. First off, the girl probably wouldn't even have needed a phone if she wasn't poor, used to use Crystal's phone. And then secondly, there's nobody's going to get upset about these minutes unless they are in a position where they can't get more of them. So those are just things that stand out to me. The morning of her sentencing hearing, Vanetta roused her children, fed and dressed them, and began re-ironing her outfit on the living room floor. Besides installing the stove and refrigerator, she hadn't been able to do much else in the apartment, and it felt empty, unlived in. Kendall joined Vanetta in the living room, standing with his hands at his sides in the tawny glow of the morning. She had dressed him in a red-collared shirt and his new shoes. A few feet away, a picture of him at his preschool graduation in a cap and gown was displayed on the mantel. Quote, "Mama," end quote, Kendall said, quote, "kids aren't supposed to go to court. They're supposed to go to daycare and school," end quote. He wasn't pouting. He was observing some strangeness in the world, a misalignment. He could have been saying, quote, "dogs aren't supposed to like cats," end quote, or, quote, "it's not supposed to snow in April," end quote. Vanetta put down the iron and took a breath. Quote, "Kendall, will you come to court with me?" End quote, she asked, just as she had the night before. Kendall saw that she needed him. Quote, "Mama, I will go to court with you," end quote, he said decisively. Quote, "if they give Mama the punishment, what you supposed to do?" End quote. Quote, "stick together, take care of my sister and brother, and listen to my TT," end quote. At the last minute, Vanetta had decided to ask her sister to care for her kids if she was sent away. She couldn't say why. Vanetta arrived at court early, quietly shaking under a conservative black sweater and matching slacks. She had put on makeup and earrings and had pulled her hair tight around her head. She paced the hallway, trying to think of what she would say to the judge, periodically stopping to watch the ponderous gait of shackled black men in orange prison uniforms. Shortcake showed up in a knit cap and winter coat, along with Vanetta's twin brother and younger sister. Ebony stayed home and watched Timby, Bobo, and the rest of the kids. Later, the preacher's wife and another white woman from the All-Bible Baptist Church, Vanetta's congregation, would join them in knit sweaters and thick glasses. When it was time, Vanetta took a seat next to her public defender, a foot-tapping white man in a plain black suit. The courtroom didn't look like the kind you see on television, those open-air theaters with balconies, large ceiling fans, and people crowded into wooden pews. It was a small space, separated from the audience by a thick wall of glass. Ceiling speakers broadcast court proceedings to onlookers. The prosecution went first, represented by a fit, pink-faced assistant district attorney with thinning hair and trimmed beard. Many things about Vanetta impressed him. She had not been arrested before and had, quote, "some employment history," end quote. She apparently attended school into the 11th grade. That is better education, as sad as that is. That's better education than many of the defendants we see, he said. He continued, quote, "she has family support. That's good. Unfortunately, that same level of emotional and family support was available at the time of this offense and by itself wasn't sufficient. I don't doubt that the decision was driven by desperation, but the fact that it was desperation does not minimize its impact on the victims," end quote. One of the victims didn't carry a purse anymore and didn't feel safe in her neighborhood, the prosecutor reported. Quote, "it is the state's view that people need to know when you use a gun to take things from other people, you go to prison, end quote. Vanetta's public defender spoke next, offering a sprawling but impassioned case for leniency. Vanetta was remorseful, he said, and had confessed to the crime. She was younger and, quote, less street smart, end quote, than her accomplices. Her friend had held the gun. It was a crime of mean circumstances. Quote, I believe punishment can be accomplished in a community setting, end quote, the public defender concluded. Quote, I don't believe you have to send her away, end quote. It was Vanetta's turn to speak next. She, quote, took full responsibility, end quote, for her actions and apologized to the victims and the court. Quote, at the time of this situation, me and my kids were going through a difficult time in our lives and on the verge of being evicted and our lights being cut off. I was overwhelmed by the difficulties, but this doesn't excuse what I have done. At this time, I'm asking for leniency for me, but especially for my children, end quote. Then it was time for people to speak on Vanetta's behalf. The preacher's wife said, quote, I have observed in her quiet calmness in the midst of trying circumstances, end quote. Shortcake offered 4 sentences. Vanetta's twin brother said that they, quote, had just made 21, end quote, and that his sister's children needed to wake up to their mother, not to their aunties and uncles. Finally, it was the judge's turn. An older white man, he began to recap what he had just heard. Quote, so this was a general discussion about the nature of this offense. Basically, that it was an aberration, a crime of desperation. I look at that, but I'm also mindful of the fact that between then and now, nothing has really changed. I'm saying that the overall economic situation hasn't improved. Has it, counsel? End quote. Quote, no, end quote, the public defender answered. He had argued that Vanetta had been looking for work. He hadn't pointed out that Vanetta rose at 5 each morning, but still had little time to find a job between searching for a new place to live, attending GED classes, and caring for her children, or that employers usually did not hire people who had recently confessed to committing a felony. Quote, no, end quote, the judge repeated. Quote, and quite honestly, I don't know that it got any better after that time. Maybe a little worse, based upon what's occurred and the fact that she's kicked around and moved around. End quote. What the judge was saying, in essence, was, we all agree that you were poor and scared when you did this violent, hurtful thing, and if you had been allowed to go on working 5 days a week at Old Country Buffet, refilling soup pots and mopping up frozen yogurt spills, none of us would be here right now. You might have been able to save enough to move to an apartment that was de-leaded and clean in a neighborhood without drug dealers and with safe schools. With time, you may have been able to get Bobo the medical treatment he needs for his seizures, and maybe you could have even started taking night classes to become a nurse, like you always wanted. And, who knows, maybe you could have actually become a nurse, a real nurse with a uniform and everything. Then you could really give your kids a childhood that would look nothing like the one Shortcake gave you. If you did that, you would walk around this cold city with your head held high, and maybe you would eventually come to feel that you were worth something and deserving of a man who could support you other than by lending you his pistol for a stick-up, or at least one who didn't break down your door and beat you in front of your children. Maybe you would meet someone with a steady job and get married in a small church, with Kendall standing proudly up front by the groom and Timby as the poofy-dressed flower girl, and Bobo as the grinning, toddling ring bearer, just like you always dreamed it. And from that day on, your groom would introduce you as, quote, my wife, end quote. But that's not what happened. What happened was that your hours were cut and your electricity was about to be shut off, and you and your children were about to be thrown out of your home, and you snatched someone's purse as your friend pointed a gun at her face. And if it was poverty that caused this crime, who's to say you won't do it again? Because you were poor then, and you are poor now. We all see the underlying cause. We see it every day in this court, but the justice system is no charity, no jobs program, no housing authority. If we cannot pull the weed up from the roots, then at least we can cut it low at the stem. The judge sighed, and a silent moment passed. The court stenographer steadied her hands above the keys and waited. Kendall, asleep on Shortcake's lap, breathed noiselessly. The judge ruled, quote, This is not a probationary case. I'm going to impose 81 months in the state prison system. It's going to break down to 15 months of initial confinement and 66 months of extended supervision, end quote. The bailiff approached Vanetta and told her to stand to be handcuffed. Quote, "Oh God," end quote, Shortcake let out. She shook Kendall awake and took him to the glass. Quote, "Wave goodbye, son," end quote. Hands behind her back, Vanetta turned around, tears streaming down her cheeks. Kendall stared back stone-faced, strong, just like his mama had taught him. That brings us to a changing of the theme within this chapter, so let's have a reflection. So, for me personally, that last passage was sort of triggering. It made me flash back to, I had a trial it's been a while now. I had a trial in December of 2021 and was found guilty, was subsequently sentenced in March of 2022. I was only given probation. The charges was 2 disorderly conducts and an obstruction of justice charge, both misdemeanors. But the maximum penalty was 12 months in jail for one charge, and then the other 2 charges were 30 days in jail. I didn't have to do any jail time. I got like I said, I got probation, community service hours, anger management class. And for me personally, the anxiety of it all was just very hard to explain, unlike anything I've ever experienced. The anxiety of going to the court dates all the time, making sure you don't miss a court date, because then they can put a warrant out for you. The anxiety of sitting through the trial, and the anxiety of wondering what the sentencing is going to be. I remember I spoke myself as well at the sentencing the same day. And so even just reading about the state's attorney speaking, her public defender speaking. I also had a public defender, and then hearing her speak and thinking about, when I spoke, the way that I felt is, it's like you're trying to, petition for your freedom, and basically explain to this white man, I had a white judge as well, why you don't deserve to go to jail or go to prison. And so to read how many months she was given, the time she was given. And again, I'm not discounting, or making it seem as if what she did wasn't also something that was wrong and it had drastic impacts on the people that it was done to. But I think far too often, and that one paragraph where Matthew Desmond says what the judge was really saying, encapsulates this well. But for me, this is just, once you become an abolitionist, you begin to understand the prison industrial complex, you begin to understand the criminal justice system and how it works. The underlying problem here is poverty, and sending her to prison is not going to make her be less impoverished. It's actually going to make it so that when she comes out, she's more likely to be impoverished, because she's going to have less things that are going to be available to her. She's going to have been further traumatized by being inside of this prison, by being away from her children. Her children are going to become further traumatized by this as well, which will up the percentages of them being arrested and going to prison and having all of these same things play out in their lives. And so we see here how the issue of mass incarceration comes into play with all of these things, is with the housing crisis and all of these things as well. Housing crisis is probably not the right term, but the issue of housing. And I think we're going to end this episode here, and we'll be back tomorrow to finish the rest of this chapter. So tomorrow will probably be a shorter episode. I want to encourage people to who maybe are listening to this, to go get the book Evicted, read it for yourself, to listen to previous episodes, as I said at the beginning of this specific episode. And we put these episodes out on a daily basis to provide people the opportunity to begin or further their journey in the struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. And I will holler at you tomorrow.